Hey, David Gordon White, thanks so much for coming on the show and for giving us some of your time. I really appreciate it. Could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Hi, Ken. Thanks for having me. Yeah, sure. I'm a retired distinguished emeritus professor of religious studies from University of California, Santa Barbara. I taught there for about 20 years, and before that I taught at University of Virginia for about 10. I had my education at the University of Chicago and at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, where I had wonderful professors who pushed me and spurred me to study stuff they hadn't done, and much of that involved Tantra and demonology and yoga. And so I've written, now I'm up to 6 books on those topics. And actually, with respect to this program, the first, which was my dissertation rewritten, is called Myths of the Dogman. And the last, which is the one I think Ken has in mind that we're going to talk about the most today, is called Daemons Are Forever, Contacts and Exchanges in the Eurasian Pandemonium. Those 2 books are about precisely the way that myths and rituals and ideas and practices traveled along that Silk Road between the Far East and South Asia and the Mediterranean world all the way to Iceland. And those topics have just, fired my imagination for decades now, and they continue to. I've got another book in the works that'll continue the book that we'll talk about mostly today. So those are my 2 books on contacts and exchanges. In between, I wrote 4 books that were mainly about the aligned disciplines of Tantra, yoga, and alchemy in medieval India. But I won't trouble you with all those details right now. We can go into the topic of today's conversation.
I think it would be good to, before we sort of get into the demonology, there's something we sort of brush on this a lot in the show, but we never really look at it with any depth, is Tantra. This idea of, because we cover a lot of Western esotericism, Crowleyan magic, that kind of thing. There's a couple of, it just feels like Tantra is one of these things that's, it's been kind of grabbed by the New Age and places like that, and there appears to be 2 tantras. Let's put it that way. There seems to be the genuine tantra, and then there appears to be the New Age tantra. So I wonder, could you talk a little bit about tantra and maybe that kind of relationship between the 2?
Yeah, with pleasure. New Age or Neo-Tantra tends to emphasize sexuality and something, akin to consciousness raising through good sex. And there's nothing wrong with good sex, but it doesn't have a lot to do with what's being sold as Tantra on internet and in these various places you can go to engage in tantric workshops and so on. Tantra, it emerged in South Asia around the middle of the first millennium, around 500 AD. And it became the mainstream form of religion in India and later Inner Asia and Tibet, China, Japan, over the centuries. And that remained the case in India down to really quite recent times. The scholarship on Tantra has been very slow to gain momentum. Until about 50 years ago, you had books by Sir John Woodruff and a couple others that were not very good. They tended to denigrate Tantra and make it out to be some sort of evil, demeaning body of practice that was basically disgusting and filthy and had nothing to do with our Western civilized tastes. But the last 50 years of scholarship by Europeans for the most part, Americans too, and more increasingly Indians, has shown that Tantra was basically the mainstream of many Asian cultures and polities and civilizations. It was a path to direct power in the world, and the patrons of tantric practitioners tended to be warlords, or if they succeeded, princes and kings, who needed to have the right magic to defeat their enemies on the battlefield, who had their own tantric magic that they were using. And over time, it developed in certain circles into a very highly developed philosophy and body of theory and practice about consciousness expansion, where the practitioner imagines, cultivates an image of the self that is identical to that of God, and in so doing becomes divinized and has the power of God. Now, an important factor in the origin of Tantra and its continued practice was demonology, because so many of the tantric practices, magical and otherwise, are grounded in fighting demons, or better still, controlling demons. And most of those demons were feminine. They were demonesses. And their legacy goes back to a few centuries BCE, at least as far as the textual record can show us. And these demonesses were especially predatory vis-a-vis infants. Women in childbirth and babies were the targets of these demonesses, who tended to eat them or kill the woman whose belly was holding the child. And Tantra more or less appropriated these demonesses and made them out to be instruments of tantric magic or tantric power politics. Whereas you would appropriate the power of these demonesses, you bring them under your control, and then turn them against your enemies. But then again, in the later, more refined forms of Tantra, these demonesses become internalized as basically facets of an enlightened consciousness that you use as a conduit to realize God consciousness and become divine, a self-made God. So that really was what constituted Tantra in South Asia for well over 1,000 years. And it was really only with the British who really were totally bothered by Tantra, because it was so not like them, so not like Anglicanism, that Tantra was pushed aside in favor of the devotional form of Hinduism that has been the mainstream for a couple hundred years now, although, again, sort of the rewriting of the revisionist history of devotional Hinduism says it's much more ancient. And there are texts to show that it was, but those texts probably didn't correspond to reality on the ground, which was that the royal patrons of Indian religion tended to rely on tantrikas, tantric practitioners, more than on purveyors of devotional Hinduism. So that's a short history of South Asian Tantra. It pretty much was the same in East and Inner Asia with the spread of Buddhism.
I remember in the book you say Tantra is considered a marginal aberration these days. It's like the Indian culture doesn't seem to really recognize, well, a large portion of the Indian culture doesn't seem to really recognize it anymore, does it?
That's correct. I mean, at least, official Hinduism certainly does not. When you go on a railroad station in India, there's all these little chapbooks, the cheap railroad station books that you can buy, and they're all about tantric magic, basically. So on some sort of popular level, Tantra is still very much alive. It's just frowned upon in good circles, in the proper circles. And that certainly includes the majority rule in India these days. Yeah.
I've seen some videos on YouTube recently of temples. I think they're in the northern part of India that seem to be still tantra-centric, I should say. They have sacrificial goat ceremonies and this kind of thing. But yeah, no, I mean, because I'm quite keen to go to India and actually see some kind of at least relics of Tantra or whatever, so I figured I've been kind of trying to figure out where it's still located in India.
What you're referring to is probably way in the eastern part of India, in a place called Kamakhya, where goats are still really sacrificed. Until very recently, they were sacrificed in lots of other parts of India. not necessarily in tantric rituals so much as in, again, royal rituals when there was a royalty. So places like Rajasthan in Western India. But nowadays they don't kill the goats. They go through a sort of simulated sacrifice where the goat doesn't die because, again, tastes have changed. But yeah, the closest thing to tantric animal sacrifice is what you find way out in the far east of the country. And then in Nepal, very much alive still. That's where you want to go to see living tantra.
Right. Okay.
It's quite amazing. Yeah. There's a lot of blood.
One phrase that was certainly kind of used largely by the occult community was the phrase "the left-hand path," and that seems to have come from Tantra. And it seems to be one of these great things where every magician you ask or every expert you ask has a completely different idea of what the left-hand path actually means. I was wondering, could you give your expert opinion?
Sure, that's a neologism. It's maybe 100, 150 years old. I don't know if it was a Westerner or an Indian who coined it, but yeah, basically right hand, left hand. There's a conventional form of Tantra that could be characterized as right-handed Tantra, where you go through the rituals, you visualize, you worship tantric deities, but you don't kill animals, you don't have crazy sex, you don't engage in magic. The people who do all those other things would be the ones that are quite characterized as Vamacharis, left-handed practitioners. But you don't find that terminology in any sources prior to the 19th century.
Okay,
but it refers to actually the more, well, no, I shouldn't say more authentic form of Tantra. The more power, left-handed Tantra is power-based. Right-handed Tantra is more just a form of individual practice that involves tantric gods as opposed to non-tantric gods.
Yeah. So would you say the demonology aspect of Tantra would be in the left-hand path then, or?
Certainly, yeah. The demonological heritage of Tantra is what constituted much of the so-called left-handed practices. I mean, I could go. Let me just go on a bit about that. There's a 9th century tantric text that I translated recently, the 20th chapter of, which is about it's called the 3 yogas. And again, it doesn't correspond to anything that looks like yoga today. The supreme yoga involves being eaten by tantric demonesses, yoginis, because when they eat you, they eat all the things that block your identity with Shiva, the supreme god. Subtle tantra, subtle yoga, involves basically someone, either a human yogi or a superhuman yogini, entering into your body, taking it over, and using it to their ends. And that also actually can be liberating when the intention of the takeover entity is a good one. And then the last one, gross tantra, is basically demonological practice, sorcery. One of the practices called the dust practice involves going onto a charnel ground at dawn and finding 2 corpses, a male corpse and a female corpse. You take the feet of the male corpse, left foot of the male corpse with your right hand, the right foot of the female corpse with your left hand, and you take the dust off their feet, and that dust, you can put them together, and then you can just control anything in the world. So that's kind of cool.
What was the other thing? Oh yeah, so there's a story in the book about gods fighting a sorcerer, and I think it's a myth, isn't it? They're fighting a sorcerer, and they create a woman from, is it from dirt or feces? Or could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
That's a really good. I love that story.
Yeah, it's a pretty racy story. Yeah. Right. So yeah, they're not gods. They're Brahmins. They're humans, and they're losing a fight against a sorcerer who's also a human. And So they decide that the only way they can fight this sorcerer's magic is to create a magical being themselves. And so they collect some of their feces and they say a mantra over it or something. And out of that comes this goddess slash demoness named feces goddess, or it depends how you translate the word male, filth goddess. And she defeats the sorcerer, and then she asks or demands that the two fellows who created her worship her, and they say no way. And she tricks them into having to worship her anyway, and so she becomes known as the filth goddess. And she actually, there is such a goddess who's worshipped in Western India, particularly in Rajasthan, who has that name. And her iconography is kind of interesting because among the objects she holds in her, I believe she has 8 hands. These figures tend to have more hands than you and I, is a bottle of alcohol. And that's also a kind of a tantric marker, because the so-called sacraments of Tantra involve flesh, fish, alcohol, the product of sexual intercourse, and the 5th thing that I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah. No, that was just kind of interesting, and I thought that was a good edgeway into the book. The first thing that really struck me with the book, the first of the kind of rituals or stories, was this idea of the male, spelled MAIL. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because this is really fascinating. Practice, isn't it? It's
again, it's a kind of a sympathetic magic. It involves a power substance. Well, what is it? There's a particular tantric god. In fact, he's the tantric god of the medieval period. His name is Bhairava, which means something like horrific or scary or scarecrow. And in Rajasthan, in Western India, in village Rajasthan, really the back of the beyond, there are a number of, he has lots of temples, but there's one in a village called, what is that village called? Anyway, there's a village in Western Rajasthan where there's this image of the god, and it's basically 6 conical pillars that are bright red and shiny, and they have 2 little marble eyes set into each of the pillars. The tallest one's about 5 feet tall, 5.5, 6 feet. And they have like a mouth hole as well. And when I visited it, the mouths of these images had some Indian bread, chapati stuffed in them. And I asked the priest, what was this about? And he told me a story that I heard a number of times in that part of India. Basically means that this god, he lives by being fed sesame oil and red powder. And the way he is fed is that people will smear that combination, also some foil, some kind of aluminum foil, on his image. And those 5 to 6 foot tall towers that I'm referring to, they were probably just rocks at the base of a tree 100 years ago. But after hundreds of years of people adding layer upon layer upon layer of this food, which is called male, which means like filth, he got really big. And the more you feed him, the more powerful he becomes. And his power can be transmitted to humans who worship him when they take a little sample of that male, of that filth, the god's body, and either place it directly on their skin, or they will smear it onto like a necklace or a wristband or a waistband. And they'll particularly put those on children, once again, because this male, these bodily secretion of a powerful god, when it's worn on your skin, it sets up this force field that demons can't get into. So once again, we're back to this logic of protecting against demons through a kind of power that is in itself somewhat demonic. And I saw that ritual in a couple places. What else about that?
What's the actual temple
Same
space
ritual.
like?
Oh, well, there's a couple in Rajasthan that I visited. One is, well, they're both open air. They're both at open air, but at the foot of trees. One at the foot of a banyan tree, which is generally one of the haunted trees of South Asian culture, and the other at the foot of another tree that's also associated with the scary stuff. Kajra, it's called. And they don't have roofs on them. They're these sort of, what would you call them? Sanctuaries with the images just there in front of you. The same practice with the same terminology, with the same God, also is found in Katmandu, in Nepal, except that the images are not aniconic. They're not just piles of mail that have grown over the centuries, or at least decades. It's actually a iconic image of Bhairava, probably a medieval one, that again, people smeared the same basic combination of stuff onto, such that the image becomes nothing more than a kind of a big red column with just the mouth of the original sculpted image showing. And as one of the illustrations in my book showed, people collect the mail that accumulates at the foot of this god in Katmandu, and they use it to the same purpose, except that it's more powdery. It's not as sticky as the stuff in Rajasthan. So rather than smearing it onto these little belts, they put it in small little bags, pouches, and they close off the top by knotting it on a string, and then they use that as an amulet or a talisman to ward off, again, demonic invasion into usually the skin of children. So yeah,
I was
that's
interested
that.
with that as well. You're talking about in the book the different caste systems that the thing that was interesting was that it's kind of it's like a lower class in Rajasthan, but a higher caste in
Kathmandu.
in Kathmandu.
Yeah, that has to do with the fact that Tantra has been discredited in India. So upper caste people, at least in public, they don't engage in such stuff. Maybe they'll do it, they'll sneak it. In fact, they often do, probably. There's some good documentation on that. In Nepal, it can be out in the open because Nepal is still an openly tantric culture, and there's no dark side to engaging in those kind of practices. It's mainstream in Nepal. But yes, in Kathmandu, it's upper class people that tend to frequent that temple I'm talking about, and not the. Whereas in rural Rajasthan, everybody's a peasant anyway, pretty much. Although there as well, that same god whose images are those 6 cone heads. He has an image in the royal cemetery of the kings of Jodhpur. That cemetery dating from before the British period when they actually still were ruling Western Rajasthan. So it's not as if it wasn't mainstream in that royal culture 200 years ago, but it isn't anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we'll talk about this a bit later, but it reminds me of the European kind of the way paganism went down into the lower. It was sort of hidden, wasn't it? It was like a lower class thing for a long time. It was more of a traditional witchcraft, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a totally appropriate comparison in so many respects. In fact, in my book, I speak of Daemons more often than I say demons. Mm-hmm. These are the little gods that preceded the great religions, including Hinduism and Buddhism of India and China and Japan and Tibet, and Christianity and Islam and Judaism in the West. They were always already there before those great religions sort of pushed them down, but they're not easily done away with entirely. So they keep showing up in interesting ways. In Catholic Europe, all these virgins of this and virgins of that, they were pagan goddesses before they became the virgin of this spring and that hillside and that grove of trees and so forth. There's no question about it. And so many saints were pagan gods before they were, you know, humorized into human saints.
Well, I mean, Rome. There's plenty of buildings that have been depaganized, haven't there? I've forgotten the name of it. I've been there myself like several times. What's the giant?
Well, the Pantheon. The Pantheon.
Pantheon. Yeah. That's a great example. And it's interesting stuff. The other thing that I found really fascinating was, and actually we were talking to, I think it was Peter Mark Adams, about mystery schools and about how the kind of myths associated with them tended to travel with traders and with, you know, they seem to have this sort of way of flowing across different cultures, and it did seem to come via the kind of trade routes, the way these myths were transmitted.
Well, certainly you had to have human agents to transmit these things, and traders were among the most itinerant human agents. So were soldiers, so were sailors, and some of those traders and some of those soldiers and some of those sailors were monks as well, or they were also men of the cloth of their various traditions. So particularly the case with Buddhism, so much of the Buddhist culture that was transmitted into Eurasia and maritime Asia was transmitted by figures who were at once merchants and monks. The two weren't mutually exclusive. But yeah, for sure, the Silk Road was an information superhighway that required informants to move that information along. And what's so interesting for me, at least, is how the same story, the same deity, the same practice kind of morphs into something else as you move along the road from west to east or east to west, because there was already some culture there that it morphed into, that it kind of blended with. And so the names change, the iconography varies, things like that. But you can still sort of peel away the layers and say, oh yeah, that's who that was. That's the sort of the detective work that I just love. It's what keeps me going.
It's fascinating. And it's fascinating seeing how it's kind of bled into modern practices as well. And do you think you might look more in, because in the book you're focused more on, I mean, you do cover some more modern practices, but do you think perhaps you'll look at how maybe in the future look at how these older traditions have kind of affected modern traditions more? Or
my interest kind of drops off after the 16th century, and I leave it to other people to make the connections in sort of modern and contemporary periods. It's just not what. When I do talk about modern instantiations of these ancient and medieval traditions, it's usually to make fun of them because they get it so wrong in general. So yeah, I wrote a book about the Yoga Sutra, the reception history of the Yoga Sutra, how it's been read over time. And well over half of it is devoted to 19th and 20th and 21st century misappropriations of the Yoga Sutra, because that seems to be what happens. And I guess it's just my problem. I'm more Catholic than the Pope. I'm a purist, and if it's not like what it was in the Middle Ages, then I don't want to know about it. Or I want to tell you what's wrong about it. So sorry, I don't go there.
So, are there any particular demons or daemons that you encountered in your studies for this book that really struck you? Was there anything that really surprised you? Would you say?
Well, I mean, so much of the book is text-based, but then there are these lovely images. There's, I think, 20 or so color images and 50 black and whites. The thing I guess that struck me, although it's perhaps the hardest to prove actually, is this the daemons, not demons, but the little gods associated with tree worship in both South Asia and in coastal Western Europe, meaning the coastal regions of northern France, Belgium, Great Britain, the British Isles, where the same practices involving hanging bits of clothing in trees, and the same outcomes, which is again to overcome disease in particularly children, match up in quite remarkable ways. There's an account given by a French monk in the, I think it's the 10th century, in Eastern France, and he tells of this place where people hang bits of clothing in trees around a shrine, and the shrine is dedicated to a saint who turns out to be a greyhound dog named Guignefort. And the monk says, well, in the end, I destroyed this shrine because it wasn't Catholic at all. It was totally bogus. But what he describes is there's several aspects to that ritual that occurred at that site in the 10th century. It's precisely what people do in parts of Western India down to the present day, with this really the same sequences of ritual that involve hanging bits of clothing on the tree, exposing an infant to the elements at the foot of that tree, eventually plunging the child into a river, and then rescuing the child if it's still alive. It's uncanny how similar they are. And this is one of the things that I sort of have tried to keep to in my writing on these subjects, is that how do we account for these similarities? There's three possibilities: either independent innovation, they're identical, but it's just because serendipity, or something like archetypes. We all have these sort of images in our minds that involve the sun and the moon and sexuality and the body and things like that, or transmission from one place to another. And when you have something that's a really elaborate, complex myth or ritual, it's really hard to say that it's the result of independent innovation or something archetypal, because it's too complicated to just be an archetype. So the only, by process of elimination, the only explanation is that it was carried there by human agents, and that's what goes back to the Silk Road again. Or well before the Silk Road, I don't know how deep into the weeds we want to get here, but we know from philological data that there were people who spoke a language that has been called Proto-Indo-European language, meaning the language spoken by people who migrated west into Europe and east into India. And it's clear through language. The word for mother in German is Mutter. It's Mère in French. It's Mater in Sanskrit. It's Madre in Spanish. It's Mater in Latin. You can do that with lots of words, words for dog, words for body parts, and so forth. So there's no question that there was a transmission of language. So why not, along with language, ideas, myths, rituals? So that's what the book we're talking about, Diamonds Are Forever, is what I'm trying to do, is connect the dots in a plausible way to say these practices and ideas and myths look similar because they had a common origin, and they were carried by people over centuries and millennia.
In the book, you talk about the sort of subversive nature of demons, and this idea that I think you say there was demons were never attached to a polis. I think you say in the book. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, again, it goes back to what I said about what was there before the great religions. That's not to say that so-called pagan religions weren't important in their particular historical and cultural context, but once you have an established Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, etc., Islam, those are the cosmopolis cosmopolises to which the great religions were attached. And the little demons and diamonds of pre-great religions don't have those connections. They're kind of free floating. Now they may not have been, again, pre the establishment of the advent of these great religions, but that's what they became, in most cases over 2,000 years ago.
So I guess the people that were involved with them were subversive as well then.
Well, either or just mobile. Again, we talked about merchants and so forth. They didn't necessarily have an allegiance to this or that particular polis, country, nation, state, whatever. Their world was wider than that, so they could sort of mix and match and morph from one culture to another. Yeah.
So they sort of avoided the polis by being a bit more transient, almost.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, something like that. But again, ideas. Yeah, I mean, they're subversive. May be putting too fine a point on it. Ideas that aren't part of the mainstream aren't necessarily subversive. So the sixth and longest chapter of my book is about this story that gets told from 1000 BC until today about getting some sort of diamond to come out of the bottom of its well that it lives in to chase a woman across hill and dale, and then gets caught by the people who want to use that diamond's body to their own ends. There's nothing subversive about it. It's just like something that survived under the radar, but which continued to. It just took on a life of its own, and so you find it in these really ancient myths, and then you find it in all these alchemical accounts in India in particular. Prime reagent of alchemy is mercury, right? Quicksilver, fluid metal. And in the Indian mythology, but you also find it in Chinese and Syriac mythology. The way you get mercury is that it lives at the bottom of a well. You get a woman to ride by the well. Sometimes she's naked. Sometimes she just had her menstrual period. And she's riding by on horseback usually. And the mercury gets a whiff of her and comes rushing up out of the well in this sort of orgasmic rush, shoots up out of the well and chases after her. And the alchemists have dug trenches or something of the sort to catch the mercury. That's got kind of it's alive. It's a daemon. It's a living being. And they kill it. But once it's been killed, then they can appropriate it and use it in their alchemical apparatus. And that's just like, wow, what a story. Yet it got told, not just a story, but a technique that apparently was widespread. First attested around the 6th century and really down to very recent day across Asia. So, yeah.
Another thing I was struck with in the book is, and I've been struck with this before when I've looked at older religions, is there's certainly more of an earthy quality to the way that these people do their rituals. They're more hands-on and biological almost, aren't they? Whereas if you look at the kind of more modern religions, they're a lot more sanitized and kind of hands-off almost.
Yes, for the most part, certainly. The archaic religions, they use what they had at hand, and they were, since they were directed towards beings whose habitat were earthly, forests, pools of water, stones, rocks, mountains, and so forth. It was very earthy. But then when you think about it, particularly, it's funny. I started out as a specialist of India and lived in India for a number of years. But I kept returning to Europe, where I now live, and I became increasingly struck by how similar Hinduism and Roman Catholicism are, in the sense that they're very much of all the senses, and they engage all the senses. So the sense of smell, incense, the sense of touch, chrism, the laying on of hands, and the sense of taste, the host, and so forth, and so on. Sense of hearing, the music. So there's that sensuality even to these great religions that I find to be sort of the survival of those earlier practices that were very much grounded in the ground and what grew out of the ground. But yeah, so those archaic practices that have survived are still very much of the soil, if you will. But even though those that have supplanted them have retained some of that. Yeah.
I suppose you could say, I mean, in Tantra, there's the use of menstrual blood quite a lot, isn't there? But I suppose, in a way, symbolically, blood and things like that are used more by the Catholics, aren't they? But
this is my body you eat. This is my blood that you drink, as Jesus said.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the wine and the host they're pretty down to earth.
One part I found really interesting, talking about Catholics, we'll stay with them for now, is this Saint Augustine. You talk about Saint Augustine and his kind of war on paganism. Could you go into that a little bit? Because that's obviously, that hits Europe a lot more as well, doesn't it?
Well, he was an interesting guy. Before he became Saint Augustine, he was a Manichaean. He was not born a Catholic. I mean, he Catholicized a lot of the world, and he was born in North Africa. But he had a lot of experience of the non-Catholic world, and it shows in his writing. And in his own way, he canonized the demons of the pagan world by naming them and saying, that these are to be avoided because they're not part of our Catholic faith. But by naming them, he sort of gave them entrance into the canon, and so they get talked about for the next 1,500 years, because there they are. St. Augustine told us about them. It's not that he was the only one that knew about them, but he's the one that sort of put them on the map. So yeah, his writing gets repeated over and over and over again. The same names, the fauns and the fata and so on, the fairies of the pagan world, in the West.
Why do you think it seems like the Catholic Church in particular had a real beef with demons, pagan kind of thing? Why do you think that was such a thing for them? Because it was a real point of focus for a while, wasn't it?
Well, that was their main adversary before the advent of Islam, certainly, and then what to say? It became an episteme, as they say, or a trope. The demonic is the battle is always against the demon and the demonic, and that's just anything you want to put under that heading. But yeah, it started with the pagan daemons, and they became demonized, and progressively over time they got scarier and scarier, until you get to the witch crazes and so forth of the early modern period, where Satan with his horns and his tail and his hooves, inveigles women into witchcraft, and they do all sorts of terrible things together. That's the Catholic world. Yeah, go ahead.
It does feel a little bit like that's happening again in a way, because you see the term Satanism and demons being used a lot in popular culture again now. Especially coming from a certain political party. I won't name them. I won't invoke them. But it's interesting how that's kind of come back round again in a weird way.
Well, it never went away, I don't think. But demonizing the other is as old as humanity. Us versus them. We're the good guys, and they're the demons. And they were called communists at one time. They're called Jews at other times, maybe still these days. And the sort of the specific names change, but they all fall under that heading of who the other guy, the bad guys are. And, I think even certainly prior to the great religions, there was always the casting the other as belonging to the dark side of one way or another. I've left out Iranian pre-Islamic Iran. That's also another case in which the high gods were always already opposed to a vast array of demons
Jinn, aren't
until the
they?
final battle, etc., etc. Very much, in fact, many scholars believe that the apocalypticism, the eschatology of the Christian and Jewish and Islamic faiths was grounded in Zoroastrian, which is like Persian religion of an earlier time. It all looks very similar. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. In the more Catholic section of the book, there's a whole section about changelings, and I found that really fascinating. There does seem to be like a lot of child abduction related stuff, doesn't there, with demons? They seem to have a thing for children. Could we talk a bit about changelings?
Right. Well, I sort of started talking about them when I was mentioning that French monk who talked about the rituals that occurred at the involving hanging clothing in trees and so forth. Because it actually was specifically about changelings. So with respect to medieval Europe, even down to the 20th century in these parts of France and Belgium and the greater British Isles that I've talked about, when a child was unusually sickly or mute or strange in some way, it was not uncommon to diagnose that as being due to the fact that demons or daimons had stolen the biological child and replaced it with one of their own, a demon child, and that's the changeling. And why did they do that? Well, because the demons, this is the general storyline, the daimons knew that human mothers were really good to their children, and so those sickly daimon children would get healed and brought to good health by human mothers, whereas the human child that was stolen by them, well, don't know what happened to them. So a mother has a sickly child. What's the cause of it? This is before modern medicine. They couldn't diagnose things like, childhood diseases or birth defects or so forth. So they said, well, it's been replaced by a demon child. And the way to get it back is to somehow coax or trick or force the demons to give back the real child who's probably healthy and take away their scrawny, nasty, mute demon child. And so there was a way to find them out. And it comes out hundreds of times in the folkloric documentation. A mother will, in the presence of the demon child who's like lying in his cradle next to her in the kitchen, she'll start cooking food using eggshells for pots and pans. And the demon child sees that, and he's so shocked that he says, "I've been around for 900 years. I've never seen anyone cooking like that." Well, when the child says that, the woman knows, well, my baby's not 900 years old. This is a demon child. And then that's how she knows, well, I've got to go through this ritual and expose this demon child to the elements, and in so doing, threaten its death. And then the demons will come and take their child back, the one that's just declared itself to be 900 years old, and give me back my child. And who knows how often that works. And you find the same body of practice and belief in Western India down to the present day. So with the exception that it's generally the case that in India, the attack occurs in the woman's womb and the child is born stillborn. And so you have to force the demon embryo to leave the woman's womb in order that the human embryo may find its place and survive. So
there's a fantastic illustration in the book of this, isn't there? Where there's like a demon up in a tree. I've forgotten what the it's. Yeah, it's fantastic.
The day I saw that just made my day. Yeah, I found that in a Danish church, a Danish country church. Somehow I got this little fellowship to take pictures of they're very amazing. They're sort of very naive art on the walls and ceilings of Danish churches from the Middle Ages that was preserved because when the Reformation occurred, they plastered over all the walls with just white plaster because they didn't go in for iconography of the Catholic sort. And then in the last 100 years, a little more than 100 years, basically the Danish Culture Museum took the plaster down, and so you have the original stuff exposed again. And in one of these churches was the account, actually it's illustrating one of 3 Catholic saints who was said to have been replaced by a changeling and then recovered. This is Saint Lawrence, who was pretty much the patron saint of pre-Lutheran Denmark. He's still the patron saint of Denmark. Half the boys in Denmark are called Lars because Saint Lawrence. And anyway, yeah. So that country church in southern Sjælland is depicting Saint Lawrence's abduction and recovery via a tree. I believe that it's from the 12th century. I can't remember exactly. Yeah, when I saw that, I thought, wow, this is paid.
So what were the actual mechanics of recovering a child from demons in terms of the changeling rituals?
Well, yeah, I've kind of talked around it, but the ritual described by that French monk that occurred in eastern France in his time, but which continued down to, at least parts of it, down to very recent times, was that the mother would take the child to this shrine of this saint that was a greyhound dog and expose it at night under the trees that comprised the saint's rustic sanctuary, and walk away and leave the child there exposed to the elements, perhaps to wolves. This was a lot of wolves around. For the time it took for 3 candles to burn down. I didn't say how big the candles were. If the child was still there, she would then take it to a nearby river and plunge it in the river, I believe 9 times. And if the child wasn't dead, she would determine that it was her own biological child that she now had in her hands because it didn't die from that terrible ordeal of being plunged in the freezing waters of that river 9 times, which is what the monk says too. He says if the child survived, it may not have been because it was a changeling, but just because it had a sturdier constitution than the mother thought it did. But that was basically oh yeah, and the other part of the ritual was hanging bits of its clothing on the branches of the tree, which was more kind of a peace offering to the saint whose sanctuary it was. And that's the part that survived down to the present day. That's why there's several illustrations in my book of these shrines in mainly Western France that are just hung with tons of bits of clothing and bits of cloth that are still used for that purpose, but more for healing rather than the notion of changelings pretty much gone by the boards. But to heal a child, you dip a piece of cloth in the waters or on the tree, hang it on the tree of the saint whose sanctuary that is. You touch it to the child's body, and then you leave it at the sanctuary and leave with it the child's affliction that's been troubling it. In cases where the child is not walking at a fairly advanced age, let's say 2 or 3, they'll do it with little baby shoes, and that's one of the illustrations in the book. It's very touching. This kind of a well that has a bar across the opening, and there's these tiny little shoes hanging in front of over the water, and that's so the baby can get its walking shoes, basically. Yeah.
Do you think that the reason that demons and children seem to be so linked is to do with the kind of unpredictability of birth and like the kind of I guess the kind of I don't know what I'm looking for, the kind of delicacy of life at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, life expectancy of children, and until relatively recent times, depending on parts of the world you're in, has been low. I mean, even in very recent times in India, one of the reasons, besides the lack of birth control until recent times, that women would have so many children was that so many of them died. And you have to have a child to perform your funeral rites when you die, or else you become disembodied wandering spirit that never gets to the world of the ancestors or someplace better. So as your kind of post-life insurance, you need to have lots of babies in the hope that particularly a male survivor will be able to perform your death rites. But yeah, in turn, until recent times, babies either were born dead or they died young. And I don't know why, because I'm not a morbid person, but I've always had this fascination with the imagery of death. And I remember my grandfather had a little cottage on a lake in Massachusetts where I went when I was, until he sold it when I was 10. And near that cottage was a colonial period graveyard. And the stones were therefore from the late 18th century, early 19th, which in the United States is really old. And I was fascinated by the inscriptions, because just about every gravestone, the person underneath the stone died before they were 20 years old, because life was hard, and especially hard on children. So yeah, that's why.
Yeah. So one of the big part of the book is, for me anyway, when I was reading through it, was like we sort of mentioned it earlier with the alchemical mercury thing, which is this idea of like pools of water or fountains of water and their connection to demons. Could you sort of go into that a bit for us? Like
Yeah,
lotus
well,
pool.
pools of water, lotus pools in Asia, and pools hemmed in by thick growths of forest in the West were considered sacred in all of those cultures. And so it was assumed that they were the habitat of this or that daimon, this or that god whose pond or pool or lake or stream that was. And so, I mean, in the body of story legend that you have, particularly from the Buddhist world, it's kind of about how the pre-Buddhist religion of South Asia was Buddhicized, because the stories generally tell about some unsuspecting, well, also Hinduized, some unsuspecting children wandering into a pool and getting pulled down into the waters beneath by the demon or daimon whose pool it was, because they didn't respect him. Usually it's him, sometimes it's her. And then they have to be rescued somehow. And in the Buddhist mythology, it's a bodhisattva, a Buddha, who, in the guise of a sibling or an adult of some sort, comes and overcomes the demon or converts the demon to Buddhism and gets him to give the child back up. And yeah, that's a story that, again, I trace from India into Sri Lanka, and then has reverberations in ancient Greece and Ireland and Scandinavia. So there, in that case, I'm saying this is an Indo-European tradition that traveled both east and west, about what happens when you are confronted by one of these demons, daimons, the little gods of a rustic sylvan pool, that you owe them some sort of tribute. You have to show them respect. If you don't, they're going to either steal you away or kill you or kidnap you, and then someone has to step in and make things right, either by force or by negotiation. Yeah. So
How about America? Like America's kind of history of demons. I mean, obviously colonization, there must be some kind of demon.
I don't know a lot of. Again, it's post 16th century, so but also, I mean, also the book, of course, is about Eurasian pandemonium. So what can I say about that? Well, of course, the Native Americans had their gods that I don't know much about. I couldn't say much about. And you have the great civilizations of Mesoamerica that had an incredible, panoply of gods, often very bloodthirsty ones. In fact, I just went to an exhibit about the Aztec in Paris about 3 weeks ago. And certainly, yeah. So with respect to Mesoamerica, when the Spaniards came and defeated the Aztec, they quickly they tried to do away with the Aztec gods, but there's no question that Guadalupe, Our Lady of Guadalupe, the patron saint, virgin goddess of Catholic Mexican Catholicism, is the Aztec corn goddess, whose name escapes me at the moment, with just the slightest sort of Christian veneer over her original pre-Christian person or personality, persona. So yeah, no question that that same sort of dynamic occurred. We can't. I mean, I don't know, and I don't believe that much is known about the divinities that were worshipped by the Native Americans of North America, because so much of their culture was destroyed in the near genocide that has taken place there.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I was struck, it's just I was just looking at my notes and it jumped out at me. See if I can find it again. Where have I put it? It is the teachings of the great peahen, the queen of spells. Yeah. What is this a text or is this a?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a text. It's the peahen, Mahamayuri, the great peahen, is this mainly. She's a Buddhist tantric goddess, and she's identified with a spell, which is the case in all of Tantra. Every god has a mantra. I use the word spell to translate mantra or dharani, that basically embodies or causes to manifest that divinity when you use the mantra correctly. So her spell is very powerful because she's one of the most powerful deities of Buddhist Tantra in South, Inner, and East Asia. And so there is a text called the teachings of the text of the great peahen goddess that contains a great body of mantras, but also stories about how lesser beings, usually demons, are defeated through the use of her spell. But yeah, there's images of her all over Asia. I leave out Southeast Asia. I keep forgetting. I shouldn't, because that's also part of the tantric world. There's an Italian scholar here, Andrea Acri, who's done great work on the spread of what he calls maritime Buddhism into Southeast Asia over the centuries out of India, that is kind of rewriting the histories. I focus on that is to say, land-based spread of traditions. He works on the water-based ones, and with great success. Yeah.
Is there? Do you think maybe there's a connection between that and the Yazidi? Because the Yazidi have a peafowl kind of god that they worship, don't they? It's like
I don't know enough about them. I know who they are, but I don't know about their pantheon, so I couldn't respond to that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, they have a peacock. Oh, what it's called now. It also begins with an M, and I've forgotten the. It sounds like Moloch, but it's not Moloch. Malak, maybe, or something like that. But it's
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a shame. Yeah, because it's the reason that obviously that they were demonized, no pun intended, by Islam, and
Right.
the great genocide of them as well. It was terrible. But yeah,
Yes.
it's one of those groups that I'm interested in. But I just saw a potential connection there. But one of the final things to talk about, which I found really fascinating, was Homer's Odyssey and the way that had sort of spread as well. Could we talk a bit about Homer's Odyssey and the connections you made there?
Right. So there's this famous episode in the Odyssey where Odysseus, or Ulysses, and his men arrive on the island of Circe, or Circe, and she's a sorceress, and she weaves these great on her loom, and she sings, and Odysseus's men go to scout out this island, and they come to her place, her sanctuary, and she quickly turns them into pigs and imprisons them in her pigsty, and they're stuck there. Although they seem to still have the minds of Greek soldiers, but they're in the bodies of pigs. And Ulysses, after they've been gone a few days, decides to find out where they went, and he goes to Circe's sanctuary, and he finds his men have been turned into pigs, and he defeats her basically by seducing her. And when they've consummated their tryst, he basically threatens her and to turning his men. Oh, I'm sorry, I left an important part of the story out. On his way to Circe, he meets the god Hermes, who gives him a magic plant that he can use to fight off the sorcery of Circe so that she won't turn him into a pig. And that's how he's able to overcome her and get his men humanized again. Fast forward, so the Odyssey, 8th century BC, thereabouts. Fast forward to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, to a text that dates from the 6th century CE, if I'm not mistaken, called the Mahavamsa. It's the Sri Lankan epic of the coming of Buddhism to Ceylon, to Sri Lanka, to that island. And in it, a Buddhist prince named Vijaya is shipwrecked on this island that is Ceylon, Sri Lanka. He sends his men ashore. They come to this pond where a sorceress named Kuvana is spinning, weaving, like Circe was. And she imprisons them in the bottom of her pool. She's attended by a bunch of other female beings that have the form of dogs. Circe also had a bunch of dogs around her in the Odyssey. And Vijaya, after they've been gone for some time, goes to find out what happened to them. He meets Vishnu, perhaps it's Indra, one of the Hindu gods, who gives him a magic thread to overcome the magic of this sorceress, which he uses when he goes to her and he seduces her and lies with her in her bed, and then overcomes her and forces her to free up his men. So it's the same story. How is it the same story? Well, there's two reasons, and I think both are operative here. One is Indo-European expansion. The story was spread across the Eurasian continent at some early time, appearing in the Odyssey of Homer and in the Mahavamsa of Sri Lanka, but also because the Roman trade with South Asia was vigorous from around the 1st century. And then the Romans and their subsequent traders continued to trade intensively with Sri Lanka down into the period that the Mahavamsa was compiled. So it is also undoubtedly the case that the Odyssey in some form was transmitted, carried, either written or orally to Sri Lanka, to that island, by seafaring traders. And so you have kind of two layers of the same story appearing in that context. But you also have a version of that story in India, in the Mahabharata, from not as quite as early as the Odyssey, but from no later than the 2nd century BC, which is still 800 years before, or 1,000 years before the Mahavamsa. So both Indo-European and transmission across, in this case, maritime trade routes, accounts for the incredible similarities between those two stories, which also have versions that you find in Ireland and in Scandinavia as well.
Yeah.
In the story about King Arthur, which is really funny, a story about King Arthur. Yeah.
That was really one of my kind of take homes from the book, was how much of this stuff travels, how it and it kind of becomes absorbed and into these different cultures. It's really fascinating, isn't it?
We're so jaded. We think, oh well, before telephone and internet and so forth, people couldn't possibly communicate the way we do now, but they did. People
Yeah.
who traveled came back and they told about the places they went to. Read the travels of Marco Polo; they're just full of great stuff. Any of those, yeah. So, yeah, those are people. I mean, it's said that one of the reasons Alexander the Great, conquered Asia was because his tutor Aristotle had told him stories that were transmitted to him from a fellow named Theseus, who was held prisoner in eastern Iran in the 6th century BC about India. And Alexander was so fascinated by these stories about dog-headed men and all kinds of wonders of the East that he didn't necessarily conquer the East because he wanted to conquer other populations. He wanted to find out about that wild and crazy stuff that was going on over there in India.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Curiosity. So, I mean, the book's like a real buffet of like different myths and rituals, and it's fantastic. What would you like people's take home from the exercise to be? Do you think?
Well, I guess being the what would you say, the liberal soul that I am, I want people to understand that we are not, all this talk about identity, racial identity, cultural identity, national identity, is such a crock because we've been so interconnected and interwoven and intermarried for millennia that there is no true American or European or Italian or whatever. We're all mongrels in the best sense of the word. These stories and practices are documentation of that. And so if there's like a moral to my story, that's the moral. But I just think they're so interesting in and of themselves. I mean, I just have such a good time figuring out this stuff. And I'm doing more of the same. Another volume will come out sometime when I'm done.
That was what I was about to ask, is what's next? And what do you have anything? Obviously, you have a new book coming out.
It's this disease I have. I have to always be working on a book. I like it. I enjoy it. And now that I don't have a university affiliation, that I always enjoyed teaching, but I didn't enjoy the administrative side and all that. And I'm so glad to not have that anymore. So all my time now can be devoted to research, which I just enjoy so much. So yes, I have another book in the works that's kind of a continuation of Diamonds Are Forever. More demons and diamonds and demonesses and Indo-European and Silk Road traditions that I've been ferreting out, some involving hero cults or stories about heroes and others about shapeshifters, mainly female demonic shapeshifters, and lots of other stuff. So, yeah.
I've just ordered, like I said to you earlier, I've ordered Sinister Yogis, so you'll probably get an email from me again soon. But thank you so much for giving some of your time today. It's been great.
My pleasure, Ken. Good to talk.